In a world with artificial intelligence, how do we transform education? Thanks for tuning in. I'm Daniel Lopez, and this is the AI Education Conversation, where we explore the opportunities, risks, and impacts of AI across education. If you'd like to join the conversation, check out the AIeducationconversation.com. Let's jump in. We're back. Hello, everyone. I'm wishing all my school based listeners a great start to the school year here in the United States. I spent much of the summer locked in on other priorities, reflecting on the conversations from the spring, and engaging in new conversations I'm excited to bring you over the coming weeks. Before we jump into today's conversation, I wanted to share some really exciting news. I partnered with Fobizz to bring my listeners two exclusive AI and education courses. The Fobizz team is working with AI and education experts across the United States to offer you quality courses on various topics, and I'm excited to be included in their catalog alongside some of our prior guests, like Coach Carly Delo in episode 60. During my summer hiatus, I spent about 30 hours developing two courses on AI and education. My course on AI detectors in education, a topic I am continually asked about by teachers as they consider how to audit for AI generated work in their classrooms, is already live on the Fobis platform and is available for free currently. I'm grateful to the many folks who've already engaged in this course and left positive feedback. I will leave the course link in the episode description, and I invite you and your colleagues to take this 30-minute course and feel free to share with anybody else who might benefit and really want to learn more about AI detectors. I will also be sure to update you when my second AI and education course drops on the Fobis platform in a future episode. Let's jump into today's conversation with Thomas Thompson, a social studies teacher who recently transitioned into full-time role as CEO and co-founder of Eduaide, an instructional design tool for educators powered by AI. The theme of our conversation today circles around the current state of AI in education and how AI appears to be taking shape in schools. We talk about AI use cases, AI detectors, student use of AI, and much more. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Thomas. Give him a follow on LinkedIn and check out the Eduaide.AI platform after listening to our conversation. If you're interested in my takeaways, sign up for the conversation at the AIeducationconversation.com. I share all show notes with my community 12 hours before sharing with my social media networks. If you want to continue supporting the podcast, that rating, that review, that follow, that share on social media, recommendation to a colleague, all of these things are free and go a long way in helping to amplify our space so that we can continue to host bigger conversations. And finally, if you are a school, district, organization that is ready to explore AI and make a change, I am available for workshops, coaching, and consulting at the AIeducationconversation.com. Humans at the heart of education. Enjoy the episode.
Yeah. How are you doing? It's nice to officially meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Thanks for inviting us to come on the show. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah. And so I know that you all, I think, are teachers. Are you not like in a high school?
My co-founder Thomas Hummel and I are both middle school teachers. He teaches science. I teach social studies. He'll be going back to school this coming school year. I'll be transitioning into doing Eduaid full time, as that's kind of we need a point person to really take the lead and be out there publicly.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, even in just seeing your website, I know I don't take for granted how much work has gone into what you all have already done as somebody who's explored a little bit what that actually takes. So, and then doing that as a teacher,
It's
that's
nice because we have a narrow focus. Like we have some specific problems we want to solve, so we just design to that and kind of cut out all the extra stuff. No point in having bells and whistles. Just solve the problem.
and what's that? What are the specific problems that you're trying to solve?
One is there's a gap in the research to practice pipeline in education. It's we have general ideas about different practices that can work, right? Deliberate practice, distributed practice, interleave practice, practice testing, elaborative interrogation, effective feedback that is actionable, specific, and timely. These are all tools that we know are highly effective. But yet there are, be they contextual, budgetary, just maybe support wise, sometimes teachers just aren't able to implement these best practices at times where it'd be most appropriate. So it's providing them with a tool set and a workspace where they can design learning experiences that best implement these best practices. We just happen to be using AI to make that happen.
Got it. So your specific scope here is, as I'm understanding it, is you're really focused on supporting teachers specifically, trying to get them, what the most cutting edge research is, or some of those timeless research methods that
Mhm.
really create high impact learning outcomes, and leveraging AI to maybe support with some of those processes, like taking it from concept to like action, in a way that it's going
Specifically.
to allow them to impact their craft. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's pretty close. So it would be like we have a feedback bot on our tool. So you input a student sample of an essay or an argument, whatever it might be, and you can run that through three of different feedback reports or your own custom one. And what that looks like is we have a RAG model, so that's retrieval augmented generation. We provide the AI that's providing the feedback with a just a corpus of literature on effective feedback, high quality feedback, examples of feedback, different rubrics that it could pull from, and that will better constrain that AI generation within those evidence-based principles. So then a student gets a feedback report that has, specific actionable steps line by line that are timely because, well, AI can generate things very quickly and actionable, and that we prescribe it to do so, but also positive. It's not going to just kind of come out and say, you did this wrong, but it'll be framing it in a supportive tone to try to help that student progress to a higher level to, reach their potential. So that's one specific example that I think kind of epitomizes what the tool does. It's like framing different AI tools within a very specific instructional context and no further.
Yeah. One thing that also stood out to me about, your tool here is that I noticed I actually saw, I think your colleague, the other Thomas Hummel, had posted about this recently on LinkedIn, and it stood out to me because it's a space that I'm often thinking a lot about, which is, and you're gonna know this as somebody who works extensively in schools. In my experience, organizations, schools in particular, a lot of the success that they have is based on the leadership, right? Like
Mhm,
the assistant principals, the principals making sure that they're highly competent, highly effective within their roles. And one thing that had stood out to me is that set of administrative tools that you all had recently added, because I oftentimes hear about the lesson plan generators are the tools that are intended to be really teacher facing. Now,
mhm,
obviously, as I'm sure you've seen across the field too, there's a lot of dialogue around these, like AI tutors is the thing that's gonna
mhm.
be, the saving grace for education. But I really think use cases like that, this administrative, like how can we make our deciders, our leaders, and our operators all highly effective in their roles? I think that is gonna be make such a significant impact in the educational experience, even if it doesn't totally flip the table on what the day-to-day experience looks like. And so that just really had stood out to me as something that you all were also doing. When I saw those behavior contracts, the policy writer, the memos, I'm like, yes, as a principal, you obviously have to be very clear and transparent in your decision making. Having
Mhm.
a tool that can help you really articulate those perspectives, how you got there, build buy-in with your staff. That seems like a really effective tool that I can imagine like principals using what they once they get the hang of it.
Exactly. I mean, for us, it's all about laying groundwork. So, as you mentioned, there are a number of student facing tools that are coming out, AI tutors, intelligent tutors, etc. What we believe is that those tools may be effective and likely will be effective maybe a year, 2 years down the road, but at this time, they're not quite fit for purpose. The reason is we have entire staffs that are not well versed in what this technology does, maybe not are even aware of kind of the underlying functions that allow this tool to do what it does. So if you're not building competence at the teacher level and also at the administrative level, kind of building out frameworks for usage, making clear policy around it, clear communication channels, clear governance, if you don't have all of these things in place, then you're jumping the gun when you go to like student facing or like whole school implementations of an AI tool. These should be more targeted interventions that are meant to solve specific problems. And then you evaluate how well they solve those problems before you move on to further adoption. And this is how you avoid this kind of bubble mentality. I'm like, I like that there's a lot of conversation around AI, but I also fear like the whole if you're not adopting now, you're missing out mentality. That's bubble mentality. That's not what we should be selling. You want to sell a deliberate approach to this thing where you make very clear decisions and have very clear rationale for why you're doing that. It really maybe comes from like our school of thinking when it comes to educational technology, which is strip away all the technology and look at the fundamental issues that you want to address and then only adopt technologies that will help you do that. You don't need to overcomplicate things, if so yeah, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel with the administrative tools. It's just what are some things that an administrator does day in, day out that may be rote or almost automatic on their end that they could use some help in outlining just so they can maybe be more effective in that messaging and get it out more efficiently and then kind of regularly. So there's that clear communication at the upper levels. I mean, I think that's a key component as you go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree more with your approach. I think that's exactly right. I think even one reason why oftentimes in previous conversations I tend to be very skeptical about endorsing specific AI solutions is because I don't always know the framework for how like they're getting from A to B exactly as you described, right? And I think oftentimes there are a lot of companies or solutions or products out there that are developing an AI tool because maybe it sounds like a good idea or it looks like make a difference in those things, and it's being grounded in this idea of like the product seems cool or the AI component of it seems like it could be game changing. But like you said, and oftentimes even in conversations I have with folks who work in schools, I approach it exactly the same way, which is I don't really even talk about AI first. I first talk about what are some problems you're experiencing day to day, and then I will then bridge the gap and show you. I mean, in recent presentations I had where I was talking to folks who didn't have a lot of AI context, I was speaking to a group of counselors. They didn't know what ChatGPT was, they didn't know what Claude was, some of these things, but I heard them talking about some of the challenges they were having in developing their scheduler for the following year. So I opened up my presentation by saying, "Hey, I heard you talking about this. Let me show you some ways that you can actually work on developing your schedule using this tool." Before we even talk about the tool, what it does, how to use it, any of that. And instantly as I had done that, their receptiveness to it, their ability to contextualize like how this is something that could be helpful for them, their whole body language shifted, right? Because
Mhm.
this now became not just another thing that I have to learn how to use, that I don't really understand what it does or what it's for or how it can make my life easier. No, I'm going to actually show you that first. We're going to ground in that, right? The
Yeah.
whole thing is going to be built on that. And I hear you operating in a very similar fashion. And I just could not agree more. I think oftentimes we are deploying tools onto education rather than
Mhm.
building this from the bottom up and saying, what are actually the biggest problems that are impacting our teachers, our young people in our schools today? And
Mhm.
then let's ground in that. Let's debunk these problems. Let's deconstruct what it actually take, and then let's ask ourselves what technology is going to be most useful in helping to mitigate that, not the other
Mhm.
way around.
So for us, it's like less about building an AI tool for education as much as it is like, what is the infrastructure for instructional design given these new technologies? Like, how does that change the way that we can source materials, how we can personalize instruction, how we can design our classrooms? What does that look like now that we have technologies that allow information to essentially be queryable, where you can, instead of doing search terms on a search engine, like with different keywords, you can ask questions and get specific things back and like actually construct with the information at our disposal. And it when you take it from that perspective, it's like less about how can I use AI to do a bunch of different things as much as it is like how does AI augment the high quality things we want to do already. And once you start from that place, puzzle pieces, it's pretty easy because then you eliminate the big universe of everything you don't want to do. And you could just focus on the very few specific things that you know we believe the intervention will have some success here. And that's just stripping away a lot to like the basic primary elements of a lesson or of the instructional sequence, which is like objective content, method, and context. Right? Those are like the four big foundational components of any kind of instructional experience. So you need objectives that provide focus and direction, content to supply necessary knowledge and skills, methods to facilitate the learning process, and like the context shapes how instruction is received and how it is applied by the students. And when you like work around those four elements, you know, there's a lot of tools that kind of reveal themselves once you've been doing it for a couple of years.
Yeah. So I mean, I'd love to take a step back just a second here to understand this further because I think it's very helpful to hear the scope of the work that you all are trying to solve with Eduade. I'm curious to hear a little bit more of. So I think I understand the scope, but I'm also curious about in the initial inception of
Mhm.
this, the development of your business here, like what problem maybe did you seek out to solve or what problems? And also like how did you get there? Like how did this
Mhm.
start? Curious like how this came up for you. I hear, you and Thomas are both educators. So how did we go from educator to eduate?
Yeah, that really starts In my journey with education, I really started paying attention to it probably my junior year of high school. My history teacher at the time, I did a project where I got to teach the class. I think you would be really good at this. What do you want to do with the rest of your life? And I was like, well, I was thinking maybe law school or this. No, no, no. You don't want to do any of that. You want to be a teacher. And I was like, how do you know? He said, just trust me. Give me a year. So I took an elective class my senior year where I shadowed him. I was just his apprentice, made his copies, took notes on how he taught, broke it down into methods. I learned more in that 1 year with this teacher than probably my 4 years undergraduate in my education teaching program. But then I did that. I went to a 4-year program, secondary education social studies from Western Pennsylvania originally, went to a school just around there. Then I moved to Maryland to begin teaching to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, Caroline County Public Schools, where I taught across the hall from Thomas Hummel. This was 2019. So I taught the 2019-2020 school year, which was my first year, and 4 years ago now, but it seems like history. But yeah, COVID happened, right? So then we're
Yeah, very
teaching.
interesting year to jump into teaching. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yes, ultimately, it probably made me a better teacher. It taught me a lot of hard lessons about flexibility, about adapting to different changing circumstances, and I learned some good lessons there that I think strengthened me as a teacher. I taught at that school for 3 years with Thomas Hummel, and then in that time, we had a lot of conversations about our field, our craft, high rates of attrition, 40% turnover year over year at the school we were working at. And then I moved to another school for my last 2 years of teaching. I'm just closer to home. I didn't feel like driving an hour to work. And same thing, 40% year over year teacher attrition. That would seem like a problem. How do you build excellence in a field that struggles to retain talent? How do you put teachers on a path to mastery when they're not given the opportunity to reflect on their craft, to actually plan ahead, like in a meaningful way, instead of just cobbling together resources in an hour for 3 different periods, like actually considering the unique needs of their learners and like that deep work that it takes to do high quality teaching? And we saw those two issues. I went to grad school, studied open educational resources. I hope that that would have been like an avenue, right? A kind of crowdsourcing of educational resources where you can share with other teachers and kind of refine and remix resources due to the open licensing affordances. And perhaps that's kind of like a professional development. And that's where my mind was at around the time that we started Eduaide. Then Thomas Hummel said, hey, I started playing with this tool, ChatGPT. It's pretty cool. It looks like you can create educational materials and they're not that bad. Could we like do a better job if we spend some time thinking about it? And I was like, well, let's do this. Seems interesting. We brought on a friend of ours, Tyler. He is an engineer, and the three of us started working together. We built Eduaide.AI in the first iteration, which was really kind of teacher facing, just addressing those two concerns that we saw, which were attrition and that research to practice pipeline, high quality materials, kind of streamlining the lesson planning process. Because there's so many task switches in the day of a teacher. You might be handling a disciplinary issue at one point, and then you are doing kind of a far reaching discussion, and then you're doing deliberate practice, and then you're in your planning, and then you have to go from one resource that your school bought to the three other subscriptions that they have. Then you go over to translate, and when you're making there's a lot of different tasks. So if you could integrate all of those in one tool, you could probably create some kind of small gains that would kind of add up to create like large savings. So then I started thinking back to open educational resources where I got my start. And it was like they kept harping on cost. And we understand like OER is free, so it saves schools money. And it's okay, AI can generate things in 5 seconds. It's going to save you time. Let's get past that and let's get down to what are the real kind of meaningful gains that you can make, the real boundaries. And out of those conversations, we just continue to iterate to this day.
Yeah, that's a helpful overview there. And I think, yeah, some of the analogies you were providing of the teacher experience, especially, definitely resonate with me. I mean, I can definitely remember, when I was that eighth grade ELA teacher, running to the copier sometimes at
Mhm.
6:50 in the morning, trying to get all these copies for
Exactly.
this lesson, for this like idea I had the day before. And I'm like, I think this is going to land really well. And sometimes just feeling so overwhelmed with having some of these like lesson plans that were provided to me and just feeling like this isn't going to land with this class. Like I
Mhm.
need to do something else to make this stickier or to like really contextualize this particular skill. And, I think having some of these tools then would have really made that experience much faster, which as
Yeah.
you described, that 30 minutes, that or 2 hours of time, I guess, depending on how quickly you can leverage those tools,
Mhm,
compounded over many days, is a drastically different experience that I'm having, at least as an educator, over 2 to 3 months, right? Maybe not in one
mhm,
day, but that is your experience for many days, that can really unlock specific things that many teachers, especially teachers earlier in their career, are still trying to figure it out, still trying to
mhm,
optimize. This could really be a difference for them just in terms of that. And like you said, I think it goes beyond the efficiency piece here. It really goes
mhm.
into, with that added time, with these sharper skills, like what then is unlocked for the student experience,
Exactly.
for the teacher experience as well, right? In
Mhm,
terms of retaining some of your most talented teachers, upskilling some of your new teachers more quickly
mhm.
as well. And
Exactly.
I think I heard that in what you were saying as well.
You wanna put new teachers on a path to an evidence-based practice, and then you wanna provide existing veteran teachers with refreshers on what that looks like. Like pilots go through continuous training even after they're a licensed pilot so they don't lose out on specific skills. I think that's a useful thing for teachers because, you know, I've only taught for a limited amount of time. 5 years is not a lot. 5 years, I think, is a lot of time for me to get a sense of the field, but there's so much more that you see. But even in that 5 years, you start to realize there are certain methods or techniques that you lean on a little bit more because you feel like they're more effective. You have a better mastery over those. So you may be doing, more Socratic seminars because that's something you're particularly good at, but maybe one lesson would be better served by something else. So having just clear protocol on how to approach that something else, or having the tool that lowers the cost of exploring those other techniques, like that just seems like something that I would have liked to have had throughout my whole practice, because the cost of exploration isn't cheap. To try a new method is a big risk in a classroom because you're trying to have a controlled environment with 20 to 30 students, depending on maybe a smaller classroom size. But, my classrooms have always been about 22 to 31 kids. That's usually the range. Taking a risk there in front of a bunch of middle schoolers is hard, right? Because you don't want a method to fail, right? You don't want to, say, lose engagement or motivation, or even kind of go beyond your classroom management framework that you've set up, and then you have behavioral issues. Those are things that you just don't want to break down. So exploration is tough. Having a tool that makes that exploration a little more approachable and a little more efficient, just, it seems like a good tool. But how you do that is important because you need to put guardrails on the tool, and then you need to ensure that the tool is actually aligned to evidence-based practices in education. And, there's a lack of clarity on exactly how these tools work. I mean, it's alarming even when you hear some of the companies that are involved in making these tools saying, yeah, parts of this is just a black box. We're really not sure. There's a
Hmm.
point to which we can explain and then no further. Okay, you want to kind of start getting into the specifics from there.
Yeah. Let's actually go there and let's dive deeper here. So I would imagine that at this point, you, like everyone else probably in our space, has heard about LAUSD and the
Hmm.
partnership that they had with All Hire to try to develop an AI use case, right? And
Hmm.
to I think part of the conversation we're having here, and I think you haven't said this explicitly, but based on the things that you have said, I would imagine this is how or you can obviously clarify, but I would imagine you see student use cases as a little bit on the riskier end as well, right? Like in terms of things that we could be doing here around AI. So I'm wondering, like, how you, Thomas, Eduaide, like how are you all right sizing some of the events that happen around like LAUSD in this? What are there any takeaways that you all are holding, even as you think of like your own strategy as an AI solution, working
Yeah.
with schools, potentially having to navigate privacy implications? Like what are some of the ways that you're making sense of these events?
Yeah, that whole situation just seemed pretty unfortunate. If I understand it correctly, it was that essentially Los Angeles Unified School District had a partnership with this company All Here to develop a district chatbot almost. And that families would then sometimes interact with this chatbot to ask questions about student performance or just general kind of questions to the school. I went on All Here's website to read a little bit more about this. And one of their product solutions was to streamline email communications at home so administrators and teachers can focus on other things. They never specify what the other things are that we're going to be doing with our time when we, streamline communication with the families that we serve as, public servants of education. I'll get to that part in a second, I guess. Ultimately, I think at this time, with such a chaotic landscape, I mean, we saw with the launch of GPT-4, a bunch of those PDF reader AI plugin companies just went kaput, like they were gone the next day. So uploading all of your county's data, like student personally identifiable information, achievement scores, all of that just seems really irresponsible at this time. That's not something you should do. That's not a safe practice. It's not what a steward of the public trust should do with entrusted data. It just doesn't seem to make sense from that perspective. It makes sense from like the perspective of a careerist who may want to have an interesting new toy and it looks good for the county to adopt that. And if it's effective, that's awesome. And I think we're going to get to the point where tools like that will become common. The space is too chaotic at this time. Companies seem to be going up and coming down just as quick. So we should focus, as we've been trying to at Eduaide, on like laying frameworks to like make those kind of tools possible. Like we need to have a clear data privacy framework when dealing with AI tools and student personally identifiable information. On Eduate, our framework is like a walled garden for instructional design. So you're not, it violates our terms of service to enter student personally identifiable information into our application. And like the one area where we figured teachers would be most likely to accidentally enter student personally identifiable information, the feedback bot, that tool serves users by streaming the information back to them. And then once they leave the feedback area, like they close out that feedback, that information is no longer perpetuated on our servers, not on our API provider servers, which by the way is OpenAI and Anthropic. Those are the two companies that we work with to offer our tools. And we can go into specifics about what AI models we use. Happy to do that as well. But like for us, we always maintained a deliberately light data footprint. We collect the user's email address to make their account and like no other information. We don't require last names, first names, anything like that. Although if you use the Google single sign-on, they provide us with your first name and last name because you already provided that with Google. But outside of that, like we don't use any of your inputs for training models. We don't even carry like user sessions to see like engagement or that kind of thing. Like our main thing is make the infrastructure to do your job on, give you a lot of autonomy to use it, make the space very personalizable. You can pick which tools you want. You can resize the whole thing, right? The idea is that it becomes your tool and kind of use it as you please. You're doing enough by paying us the $5.99 it takes just to keep the lights on. We don't need to then break you down into like little data pieces to monetize you even further and keep your eyes on the site. We just want you to solve a problem. It's really that simple. So maybe that's because we are teachers and we just kind of want to cut out a lot of some of the BS that we notice just in the field because education is a very faddish profession. Like different things come and go very quickly, new technologies, new adoptions, new big endeavors that are going to fix all the problems of the school, but like they get adopted and then kind of forgotten about after 2 years. That's the kind of stuff we want to avoid. You want to build lasting infrastructure in education. You want to boil it down to the most effective principles that you can employ in the classroom and as an administrator. And you want to build trust. So you need to be very transparent about how you're using the family's information that they entrust you with. And, you know, building a new tool to then streamline communication so it's harder for families to actually chat with someone who works at the school does not seem like an effective use of the technology.
Yeah, I think those last 2 points you especially made really struck a chord with me because I 2 things I'm, like, noticing right now, which I'm really trying to be more explicit about in some of the circles I'm a part of is, number 1, I am noticing a little bit of a conflation here between artificial intelligence and ed tech companies now, right? It's
Mhm.
becoming ed techified, and I think there's obviously pros and cons to that experience, but I think one of the potential cons is that now when individuals think of artificial intelligence, they think of it as a lesson plan generator. That is their
Mhm.
entire understanding of what artificial intelligence is, right? And I think depending on how that experience goes, good or bad, that is going to then define like your entire perception for some individuals working in schools of what artificial intelligence is, and they're going to mark it up one way or another, right? And I think that for me feels very concerning because I think as and many of us know, artificial intelligence is a general purpose technology. It's going to have many
Mhm.
implications across schools. And I think to not think of it that way is potentially reducing the opportunities we have to really transform what schools look like in over the
Mhm.
next 10 years, right? With use cases that we might not even be thinking about yet. And then I think the second thing you said, which really struck a chord, is this idea of, building trust with schools. The way that I describe it is, education. I think the companies and the solutions that are lasting and the ones that we need in education, right? To be extremely explicit is we need partners, not products, right? We need folks who are going to actually work with our schools to build trust, to recognize that the problems that schools solve are complex and they evolve. So your
Mhm.
products need to evolve, your tactics and services need to evolve, right? As you're supporting partners. And who's going to be with us there in October, right?
Mhm.
When the going's tough, everybody's stressed out of their minds, everybody's busy, everybody the school feels like it's on fire.
Mhm.
Who's actually going to be there to support us with some of the problems that we're solving and some of the commitments that we made at the beginning of the year, not just taking our fee for service and saying best of luck to you and saying we're
Yeah.
going to check in for a mid-year conversation at the start of January or whenever it is, right? And I think you're absolutely right that being able to have the companies and the entities that are going to engage schools that way, in that relational way, because schools are all about relationships. I think those are the ones that I hope survive and are the ones that are presented to our schools, because schools do need partners. But I also recognize many schools are hesitant to adopt many new partnerships because they also require work. It's not just
Mhm.
you sign on the dotted line and then you don't have to do anything. It's a two-way street. It's a relationship. And schools have to do things too. And depending on how equipped that partner is, those expectations that come into that relationship, it may not actually be a good partnership. And I think schools have those preconceptions of previous partners they may have had as well,
Mhm.
and might be carrying that into new partners they decide to bring to their school, AI or not.
Yeah. I mean, hype does not lend itself to good policy at all. So there's many more options than partnering with a company or another entity. I was just talking to some folks in the state of Maine, and they're building their own tool for their school use case, which is great. They got the server, they're going to host their own model. That's far more secure. That's something they have total ownership and control over. But it's maybe not every school has the technical wherewithal or the capabilities to do that. So they're going to look for partners, as you were saying. And at that point, then you want partners who are going to offer like a transparent experience, very clear roles and responsibilities around data privacy and retention and things like that. Just, it's an interesting moment because technology feels like you're in some sort of paradigm shift, but like with, the way the internet feels these days, you're never sure if what you're actually reading is like the true, like I'm in the middle of a paradigm shift. Because then you look around, you're like, what is AI concretely changing in my day to day life? Is it affecting how I go about what I do? And maybe it is in very subtle ways because our lives are so wrapped up in our devices now. So if it's affecting how we process information on those devices, it's probably going to affect us in some interesting ways that we haven't even considered yet. So it's okay. We're in a paradigm shift. So what does that mean for educational technology? What does that mean for the institutions of education? And how do you adopt to that? I mean, there's a lot of questions. I definitely don't have the answers on them. I mean, I'm just trying to figure them out all the same. For someone who is on the, educational technology side and building a workspace and building a tool for people, you know, it's, as you were saying, we think of ourselves less as like a product and more as just like a utility. That's how we want to frame ourselves, just kind of the rails upon which other work is done. And then what you do with the work after you create it is really none of our business, right? That's the focus of the teacher and of the institution at that point. So a lot of that leadership is going to have to come from within the school, right? So you're going to need, as you were getting at earlier, strong assistant principals and principals, as well as like the central office staff working collaboration, clear communication with their teachers. I mean, all the things that you need for like meaningful school change definitely apply here. What the technology will change in that regard, I'm not sure. Not sure how much of the best practices are changed because of this technology, like clear communication and transparency inside the institution between stakeholders outside of the institution. That's all still stands. Maybe it'll change the nature of the ed tech companies that are using AI tools. Maybe more companies like ours will become the norm, which are kind of smaller operations that are able to be founded by teachers, people who have experience in the classroom, making clear use cases instead of like tech coming to education. You can kind of bring education to technology if that kind of distinction makes any sense.
Yeah, that last point especially is something that I've been thinking about. I know even recently with like OpenAI's recent scale that they released for the 5 levels of artificial intelligence, I guess intelligence, and they had recently said that they think we're at level 2, which is, talking about being able to have pretty competent models, and then level 3 is agentic. But I was something that stood out to me about level 5 is they essentially talk about AIs that can function as like organizations, right? And I've heard
Mhm.
people like have this same thought, this idea that there may actually in the future be multi-million billion dollar companies with 5 employees because AI is able to do so much. And so I think to circle back to the point that you just said, it does make me feel like educators who maybe didn't have specific technical expertise that may have been required either on the entrepreneurial side or in just the technical skills you needed to create a like a software type product in the past, maybe those are no longer barriers to entry. And
Mhm.
really in this particular context, what matters is the subject matter expertise. And that then leads to a proliferation of boutique type tools like
Yep.
Eduate in the current state that do actually create a tremendous impact for schools, which I think would be great.
Yeah.
I think to also circle back to something else you said, what how are you right sizing this moment? So I think you had talked a little bit about the internet might be saying this. I'm
Mhm.
noticing this. Based on your experiences with Eduade, like where do you think we're at? Do you think it feels like it's trending more towards fad in the context of education? Does it
Mm.
actually feel like a paradigm shift as you described? Where would you say that we are based on the experiences you've had?
I remember last year in March, if you go to any kind of PD or event that was talking about AI, you were going to see a lot of images of robots and stuff like that. A lot of the pop culture preconceptions of what AI is. To draw that distinction a little more clearly, I'm a big Star Trek fan. We're not at the level of Lieutenant Commander Data, which is the aware android. We're more at the level of the computer, which is just like a computer that is able to interact with people in natural language and make information queryable in a way that doesn't require us to click through links, but just interact with our knowledge in a more natural way, I suppose, in that we can carry on a conversation. So that changes how we have to interact with these systems. It's not interacting with Google where you just plug in some keywords, see what comes up. You're not running a search, so to speak. So that does reformat our relationship with technology in that you're going to have a conversation. So you're going to have to actually use, good English, so to speak, or whatever language you're speaking, grammatically correct usage of your preferred spoken language. So what does that look from a design perspective? So like on our tool, like we have the enhance button, which is if you type in a few keywords, you can hit enhance. It'll take those couple of keywords, translate it into a learning objective, and then use that for the basis of generation. Given the architecture of the models, which is that they're going to take your input and then they're going to supply you with an answer or an output that is most statistically relevant to the input that you provided it. My concern is that if you're inputting misuses of language, if you're inputting incorrect information, all of this can then be perpetuated in the response, which is going to just create more problems than it's solving because you're just perpetuating your own misconceptions, assumptions, biases, etc. So building a tool that kind of puts on the rails so that doesn't happen seems important so you can improve accuracy. This is kind of going off on a tangent from what you asked, but I guess the point I'm trying to get at is that where we are at is like still early days figuring out what the constraints are for these smaller tools. And you were getting at like the importance of subject matter experts in these kind of companies and things like that. I think what might be more important would be the multidisciplinary approach to these technologies and understanding the diverse range of connections that they are making and that we should make in regards to their usage. S- So I think that also changes what schools should be doing then, taking a more multidisciplinary approach to instruction, stressing transfer of learning more and understanding exactly what transfer means because the jury's still out there and there seems to be debate. So nailing down on some of these terms that we keep batting around in education may actually end up clarifying some of our use cases with AI. Like a lot of the language in education is still very messy. Transfer, critical thinking, collaborative learning skills or things like that. What do these things actually mean? So we need clearer definitions on those so we can understand how they actually relate to these technologies because we often use like benchmarks of human intelligence for judging it. I don't mean the benchmarking of these tools, like the error rate benchmarking and all of that, and the tests they run are based on human intelligence. I mean, how we judge these tools are often based on our own conceptions of like how human intelligence works. So we need to get better about that, which means that hopefully we could do metacognition work with students better. So then they're considering what their thinking is and how they're arriving at their assumptions and conclusions. Like The technology is very intertwined with knowledge, which means it's very intertwined with education. So it's going to be a very intimate relationship between this technology and schools. I'm not precisely sure what that's going to look like, but I know that whatever form it ends up taking, the best possible steps to take today are going about creating those foundations and frameworks that you can build on top of, and not trying to get to technology solve all my problems now mode. It needs to be very much like, how is this technology going to change the nature of my work? And what are the positive use cases? What are the boundaries? And kind of developing around there. And when I say developing, I don't mean like ed tech companies developing. I mean like schools developing policy, developing frameworks, maybe even developing their own tools if they want to do something like what Los Angeles was trying to do, but hosting it themselves so they can, have that ownership and control.
Yeah, to the last point you were making there, just around like having to modify and in some cases throw out the playbook, right, and develop new frameworks, new ways of just learning and being to
Hmm.
explore how some of these tools may enhance our experience. I think that exact point is why I've been pretty consistently saying that I do think AI is going to transform education, and I know that there's a lot of folks in this space who have varied perspective. I think some don't think it's actually going to transform education at all, glorified text generators, some of those perspectives. And I don't know that any one tool as of today is in of itself going to be transformational. But for me, I think the conversations that you just described that I think schools have to have, those are going to hurt for a lot of
Hmm.
schools. It's going to be hard. It's going to require us doing a lot of unlearning, right? To modify our frameworks, to modify what we actually think schools should be learning. That's going to lead to very different ways of being in terms of actions, things that we have to do, maybe new
Hmm.
lessons, maybe new units. And I think that's going to be difficult. But I also think that's going to lead to that transformation. That's gonna be the,
Yeah.
like, growth that we haven't had, that even the pandemic really couldn't bring on, right, in terms of a type of growth and the type of transformation I think the landscape is ripe for, and I hope that we're, finally at a stage where we can have this conversation about saying, "Okay, this is what it's looked like in the past as you described. These have been the terms that we're using. This is the way we're discussing it. This is the general exchange that has happened," right? We're using search in this way, talking about it in this way, it leads to this,
Hmm.
and to most effectively leverage this technology, it's going to require different exchanges, different
Exactly.
interactions, and we have to think about that first as we're also thinking about what the technology is in of itself. And I'm excited for that
Hmm.
conversation. That is something I feel like schools could continue to have right now, which in my experience, again, I think there's a massive spectrum for the schools that are even having that conversation. I think there's clearly some pockets and some states and some bright spots where it is happening and other places where it's not happening at all. But I think even if we have those conversations, regardless of tool adoption, that is going to be, I think, well worthwhile in terms of what it actually does to set up your school and position your school for whatever's to come next. AI scaling or not.
Hmm. Exactly. I mean, if anything, I hope the technology forces us to be precise. That's like my main takeaway. Precise in our language, precise in our objectives, precise in our goals. Just kind of accuracy, diligence, and objectivity should really be kind of the foundational virtues with which we pursue these technologies. What that might look like then would be, hmm, see, that's the tougher question. So what does that actually mean concretely? It would first mean rectifying all the terms that we're using in education. That's like a great first step. Like, how are you going to prompt an AI to encourage students to engage in critical thinking when you, as the teacher or as the school, aren't even very sure what that it means in itself? For us, like when we want to do critical thinking on our platform, we say that the material should engage students to apply prior knowledge in novel situations effectively, which is I'm using what I know in a new situation where I've never had to use that and I do it well. To us, that's what critical thinking basically means. Now, I think there's a defense for that in the research literature base, and that's the base that we use for our retrieval augmented generation. We do that kind of stuff. Um, but that's the work that every school is going to have to do, and that the kind of academic community around education will need to do better at. I think it's going to make research much easier, which will be interesting. It'll be much quicker for a teacher to run a broad scale literature review on the based on, I don't know, effective feedback or effective direct instruction, and then be able to pull out like real insights from that quickly and figure out what that means for their practice. That's going to be interesting. It's also going to be interesting when it changes the nature of what collaborative planning really means. So I'm maybe still planning with another pod of teachers, but collaborative planning today can be very ineffective, especially when a district, say, requires all teachers in that subject area to be aligned day by day. I mean, that's what happened at my last school. Like we had to be on the same page every single day. And it's, well, I'm in the co-taught classroom. So I have students, half of my students have IEPs. Like I need to make different accommodations in the classroom. So like my path of learning is going to look different than the path of learning to the other eighth grade teacher up the hall who's teaching a general education section. So, but you want us to be on the same page day in, day out. That just doesn't really make sense from the standpoint of the needs of the students. So being able to put that more front and center, because you can now have the resources to create materials for those students on the spot, that will really change the nature of kind of like what day to day looks like for a lot of teachers. I mean, there's just so many areas that are going to get touched by this technology, and each area comes with its own range of just different considerations and boundary conditions, and areas where it's not going to be effective, and areas where it can be helpful and harmful. Just many, many considerations to make, so that you need conversations that are starting at the like departmental level. So teachers in the same subject areas, grade levels, between admin and teachers. Like you need to have a very clear understanding of goals and be aligned on that so you can use these technologies effectively. So that means professional development, capacity building, a whole bunch of other work there. But I mean, that's the foundation of every good school endeavor.
Yeah, the on-ramping, I think, as you're describing, is definitely gonna be critical, and I again, I don't think you can spend enough time doing some of this just foundational table setting here
Mhm.
before really getting into application. Speaking of, application, one thing I was very curious to get your thoughts on, as someone who's able to see a little bit of both sides, AI detectors. So, I know you have some experiences on the ed tech
Mhm.
and what the technology can actually do and what it's actually able to do. And then obviously on the school inside, I mean, based on your experiences, do you think we may have some differing opinions? And I think many folks don't, do they actually work today? But so maybe to extend that question a little bit more broadly, do you think they could work? And if things are going well, and also, do you see a role for them in schools?
I'm bearish on AI detectors. I'm not sure they actually are really like effective areas to be putting our attention right now. Here's why, because maybe you can get an AI detector in that it could detect like purely written AI generated content wholesale. So like a blog post that was totally written by an AI from just like prompt output publish. Like maybe that makes sense. But yeah, there's just so many different use cases of AI that I think make it harder and harder to detect if this is actually AI generated text. Now, images, audio, video, completely different things. I think will have their own kind of frameworks for, managing how to understand if that's AI generated or not. I think maybe some sort of system around watermarks or something in the metadata to identify material as AI generated will be a more effective way of doing this. So that is something that we should consider beyond being able to detect AI material without any kind of indication that it was generated by an AI. We need a better way of just indicating that this material is AI generated. So that would be on the part of the tools being offered, I think. That said, yeah, just so many different permutations of like how AI writing could take. Let's say I have two paragraphs written and I ask an AI to edit those two paragraphs. Well, it's gonna use a lot of my language, it's gonna use some of its language. The line, I think, is very fuzzy, and then the degree to which I do editing afterwards. I mean, if you use let's say you have a pre-written, just kind of rough draft, 2 paragraphs from a page paper, so you've got a lot of extending to do. You ask an AI to expound on your points, then you run it through Grammarly and use it like word changing format, and then you added some of your own writing. Like, at that point, what even is that anymore? It's a combination of two different systems and your own work. And let's say you run a perplexity search as well, and then utilize some of that information. You're pulling from three different sources, which in themselves are pulling from so many different sources. And then you are doing your own writing. Those lines are really blurry. And I'm not sure any AI detector would be able to reliably tell you which parts are or are not AI generated. Because again, if an AI is pulling out of the statistical likelihood of that word or sequence of letters occurring in its context, it's because that word gets used a lot. So just simply saying, well, AI uses facilitate. So anything that uses facilitate, I know I used facilitate back in 2016. Now we're going to limit the amount of language that we can use. So just that whole area gets blurry and messy. So we need to get better at understanding that a lot of the information we are going to consume will have some element of synthetic information in that it is just kind of strung together ideas. So it's going to depend on how it's used. I mean, there's so many false positives now as well, where they're ringing papers as AI generated, even though they're not, or totally missing ones that were. So I'm not sure they're effective technologies. Maybe they will get better. Maybe, you train a large language model on noticing large language model generated materials. Maybe it'll get really good at detecting material that has had some level of augmentation. But then we as a society need to determine what level of augmentation we're okay with. Like, how much AI use in writing are we fine with? Are we fine using it as an editor? Well, how much do we want to take its edits to heart? I mean, we really are already using AI as an editor. Everyone that has Grammarly on their computer and has, changed their tone to be more appreciative or whatever, Grammarly will tell you to do. I mean, our writing has already been irrevocably be changed by computer algorithms.
Yeah, I think I land somewhere similar in some of the experiments and just in my own thinking. I've done prior episodes and some one-off experiments where I've tried to test my own writing, test AI generated writing. And to your point, I mean, it's not always wrong. There's some instances where it actually accurately did capture that this was AI detected or it wasn't, but it's wrong enough, and I was able to do it fast enough to where a student who's really motivated or is able to do this a little bit more sophisticated. It's very difficult to ascertain how a teacher is going to accurately leverage those tools to across with 100% confidence be able to detect whether a student used or did not use AI based on the hopeful scale that they
Mhm.
were also implementing in their class alongside that assignment, right? Whether or not they were allowed to use AI or not. And I think to quickly ask a follow up related to this here, in my experience, this continues to be probably the most talked about AI thing in circles that I'm a part of that involve teachers and school based
Mhm.
practitioners. Still, even today, even with this, I think what we described as being pretty large headline, maybe the driving headline right now for a lot of the school based circles I have been in on whether we should be using them or not. The folks are still asking about it. So my next question maybe is what do teachers do then if they're not using AI detectors?
Yeah.
How do they actually promote authentic student work in this new world that we now live in?
I guess I'll do this in two parts. The first part kind of reflects on a little bit of what we were talking about just a second ago, which is that that's going to require us to have a very uncomfortable conversation, which is if there are false positives and we are accusing students of academic dishonesty, even though they weren't, and that's going to have a negative impact on that student. So that's why we want to avoid that, right? But you're never going to have 100% certainty. So at what percentage of false accusations are we okay with, so long as it roots out all cheating of this form? Are we okay with 20% of the time we are ruining the grade and like record of a student who is totally honest? Are we cool with that just so long as that we get root out cheating altogether? It's at what level are we going to be okay with AI detectors being wrong sometimes, that it's okay because they get it right most of the time? Is there a number? And I bet a lot of schools are going to grapple with that. Maybe some school totally fine with 92% accuracy with an 8% chance of false positives, right? Okay, I'll take that. Is the school going to take that? Totally depends. That's a tough discussion that a lot of people are going to need to have, and teachers as well. So once you maybe get AI detectors, if such a thing is possible, to have that kind of 95% accuracy, there's going to be tough conversations in schools, and that'll be interesting. And ultimately, there will definitely be students who are just kind of casualties to that policy, like failing a class or failing a project or getting some sort of academic consequence or something on their record because of that accusation. That's hard. So maybe you reform what you're asking students to do, right? Is it important now that we write an essay as much as it might be I give you an essay with a bunch of mistakes on it and you can use AI and you need to go about correcting those mistakes and explaining your rationale, and now you're considering what makes a good essay and considering the components, you kind of reframe that exercise to use the technologies to your advantage. Maybe you reform it to do the exact same thing where it's like the student will write an essay, really short form with the idea that it doesn't have to be perfect. It's a rough draft. Then you're going to run it through an AI, have it edit it. And then you're going to reconcile those edits against your own work and talk about how your paper changed or something like that. These exercises use AI, give students some autonomy, tell them, hey, there's this technology. You were probably tempted to use it before, but now I'm telling you you can. So you're kind of giving them a way and an outlet to use it in a way that's productive. So you're modeling what positive usage of that technology is. You were doing AI literacy work, you're doing digital literacy work, but you're also engaging the students in your subject matter area. That's going to be huge. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting innovations from teachers from the classroom and how these technologies can be utilized in that way. So it's going to be not like AI proofing your assignments, but understanding that like you're a teacher and you're using AI to collaborate with why and how, and then what does that relationship look like on your end? How do you model that positive relationship for your students? How do you make assignments that kind of deliberately engage students in those interactions and kind of build from there? So that's again going to be tough conversations and reflection. And that's one of the problems I have about a lot of these companies kind of selling the idea of time saving, which is you might not be saving time with these technologies. You might be changing the nature of your work, so changing how you're spending your time. But, you know, is generating a material, then proofing that material, and then personalizing that material to meet unique learner needs and creating different copies. Is that saving you time or is that maybe changing the nature of that hour that you would be spending? And that's kind of what we're getting at on our platform is sure, it'll compress the amount of time it takes for you to do any one given thing, but that just opens up the ability for you to do the other things you just didn't have time to do before. So we're not really saving time as we're just enabling you to make better use of it. Modeling those relationships for students will be big. I'm not sure AI detectors are going to be the way to go for that.
Yeah, no, that resonates. So, like, some other thoughts I have around how teachers might be able to grapple with this, curious to hear what you think here, if you agree or you have a different take here, which is, I think part of what these AI tools also open up now, obviously, we would have to walk the tightrope a little bit with the student privacy concerns. I don't necessarily think AI tools exclusively are the only way to do this, but I think one clear option for me is like just making assignments multimodal. Like we've leveraged essays, short answer responses so much that tends to be the go-to for any type of assessment or assignments for the majority of work that we're using in classes. Why can't a student create a podcast episode to demonstrate a competency? Granted, I understand it's much more difficult on the grading, and why can't they generate an artistic piece or an AI generated image or a non AI generated image, and being able to leverage some of these different modalities? I wonder if that would increase engagement for them in the assignment. They'd be more excited to do that because that feels much more interesting to them than an essay. I also think something else that I've highlighted quite a bit is trying to find opportunities to personalize that skill or that assignment with something that they might be very interested in. So if you're reading a book and there's a character that you want them to analyze or a specific plot point, is there a way that you can then invite like a personal passion area or interest to be able that they can then bring into the assignment? I'm thinking about ways that we can really work to increase engagement because I guess like where I land on it is fundamentally, I think if a student really wants to cheat, they're going to find a way to do that. That was even prior AI that existed, right? That's not new. So in my experience, two ways to combat that is you have a strong relationship with your students and you make your class fun, interesting, worthwhile, right? And I think if you do that, it doesn't negate all cheating, but I think it helps tremendously. I don't know what your thought is there.
I mean, we're pretty much in line on that one. For us, it just kind of reinforces the need for more of a multidisciplinary approach, giving students multiple avenues for thinking through different problems and solving them with different materials that they've learned from their classes, right? And then combining that to do that problem solving. This is a change that we've needed for quite a while now because the nature of kind of the world we all inhabit is that work is increasingly multidisciplinary, right? Even in the work of being a history teacher, I very rarely just use my historical background and my instructional background. I had to pull from a bunch of different fields and areas, right? As a teacher, I think we all consider principles from psychology much more than we maybe think that we do. We employ a lot of concepts around management, also just basic concepts from economics would even be effective in the classroom around budgeting and incentive structures and things like this. I mean, creating incentives for students is huge. And I think using what's an example? Like games for engagement, right? I'm all for educational gaming. I think it's a very effective learning technique when used in appropriate ways, right? One of my earliest experiences was running a Reacting to the Past seminar, which is just a like multi-week seminar for college freshman students, and it's a giant role-playing game. And they take different characters from history, but they have all these assigned readings. They do end up doing much more work in doing historical thinking, pulling apart sources and considering bias and all of that than they would in just kind of a standard seminar classroom. But throwing out like a computer game that just has a student answer a question like every 5 minutes of play or whatever it might be. Like that's not like it's like a duct tape on a larger problem. Like just having the game as itself, like this will engage the students. It's like engagement needs to come from the content itself and the way that you're structuring your class. And you can't just rely on like surface level amusements to get student engagement. So I think you're right about that. You need to go deeper to the purpose of your class and how that's going to relate to the student to give them a sense of ownership. This isn't something you need to get through. This is one of the few opportunities in life where you have a chance to invest in yourself and provide yourself with foundational skills that you need for life and that will be useful through life. And then being able to back that up by understanding that what you're teaching in a history class is not necessarily US history, but you're teaching students a mode of thought that comes from your discipline and how that relates to their life. Same with science, same with math. I think same with ELA and most of your elective courses. Like it's all about engaging students in these different modes of thought that they may or may not employ throughout their lives. And selling that to the kids, I think, will be huge in terms of engagement and getting their buy-in. At least that's how I have always approached it in my classroom. And, I've had great success with this, students engaging in just much deeper conversations than I maybe would hear in other classrooms where, I'm actually asking them to think for themselves. And like, that's refreshing for a student, like giving them that permission. Like, I want you to think for yourself, question me as a source, question the textbook as a source. And like when you get into that mode, the students start to understand what you're doing is not being a teacher and giving them work to fill time because they do pick up on this. It's I'm investing in you or giving you an opportunity to invest in yourself and creating that engagement from within, that motivation. Those are standard practices that I think a teacher needs to master, right? To create that kind of level of motivation in the classroom. I'm not sure that's something that will be solved by a tech intervention, but I think it will give a teacher tools to say capitalize on that motivation and buy-in. So if a student feels like you're having them right because you're giving them an opportunity to work on their persuasive skills, something they're going to need in their life, like that is where the engagement's going to come from. And the desires are not cheap because while I'm working, if you convince a student that cheating is against their own best self-interest, that seems to be an effective technique. Appeal to the student's best interest. Like this, we're not doing this to fill time and have an educational activity. We're doing this so that you can take some time to think about what is persuasive? What does it mean to persuade someone? Why is it necessary? And then you have students start thinking about like, who benefits from persuasion and how does this billboard persuade me? Make those connections and, to drive these things home, so to speak, to their day-to-day experiences.
Yeah, you alluded to this in what you just said, but maybe to specifically call this out further, student learning. To what extent do you actually think AI tools could be helpful in increasing student learning?
Ultimately, I think it'll have a huge impact, but only so far. What that would look like is AI is really good at the form of language, right? But it doesn't understand meaning behind language in the way that we understand meaning, right? So, like when I say it's hot outside, you attribute certain mental images to that. You think about experiences where it's been really hot out for you. You know what hot feels, and that there's different kinds of hot, right? Is it dry heat? Is it humid? What does that mean as well? And there's these many different connections, some very personal that you might make. It's why like nostalgia is a very interesting emotion that people feel. Like certain images or words or smells or things trigger these array of experiences that you had, that only you had. And AI doesn't have that. It doesn't have experiences in the world. It has the form of language. It can string together things that seem like coherent sentences imbued with meaning, but it's us that is giving it meaning, right? So that means it also transfers over to the instructional component, which is like the teacher is the one who is going to imbue these things with meaning. The student is the one who is going to imbue these things with meaning. So you need this kind of socially mediated area in between the AI and the student. So an AI tutor is a great tool in that it'll be able to track that a student really struggles with this topic or this specific work around this specific standard or something like that. And then flag that information and have the student work on it and close those prior knowledge gaps. And it could do all of that work and it's going to get really good at it. I think the predictive analytics piece and deliberate repetitive practice and proper timing for interleaving new concepts, like it's going to have practice protocols down very soon. I mean, that's going to be really exciting. But what it's not going to pick up on is that the student really struggled with this concept because they were up until 2 in the morning last night because their father was in the hospital or something. But I, as the teacher, know that because I got a handle with care message from my school counselor. So now I know to approach the student in a slightly different way, in a slightly different context that day. And I can pick up on that as the human in the room, whereas the AI tutor would just keep drilling you until you close that prior knowledge gap. 'Cause that's all it's thinking about. It's thinking about the cognitive, but it's not thinking about the social context where learning occurs. So the effects on student learning will be big in the cognitive realm, in the form, and like the academic piece. But there's this socially mediated thing that we also pick up on in the classroom that is still going to be human centered, still, of course, require the teacher to do. And I think the relationship in that you have teacher and student through the course of a year won't change all that much in the near to long term. Just I could see maybe a deeper tech integration in that a student has a personalized tutor following them through their school career and offering practice assistant and one-on-one tutoring assistance when a teacher can't. There's three real big parts of teaching, which is like instruction. That's me doing direct instruction or facilitating a very controlled conversation or doing deliberate practice. But then there's also like seminars where I'm having a discussion with students. But then there's coaching and tutoring, which is really small group. And that's highly effective, but a lot of teachers don't have the time or the space to do that. That's where I think AI tutors and augmented assistants will be really effective in that one on one or in that small group coaching arena, and then having the teacher around to offer kind of those social supports.
Yeah, some of the use cases you were highlighting there, I think bring up another big question that I know some folks are interested that I'm also very interested in. How will relationships change with some of having AI chatbots, augmented chatbots? I know that some of the most popular AI tools out there today, character AI, replica AI, and fundamentally what these tools do is they're trained to have a perceived personality, of a celebrity, historical figure, a general persona of, say, let's say like a psychiatrist, a therapist, and that has been, I think, a use case that has really stuck with a lot of folks, especially students, young people. I'm
Mhm.
curious if I were a fly on the wall in some of the conversations between the Toms on strategy or things that you're thinking about in the future. What have some of your conversations around relationship look like? Like, how are you all thinking about that intersection of AI and relationships and the implications there, and just making sense of that?
Not everything needs to be, I'm using air quotes here, optimized or made more efficient, right? Human communication, I think by its nature can be, I don't want to say not combative or not aggressive, but like there's a push and pull. There's a tension oftentimes between people in that you and I, like even in this call, it's been here in that you have a perspective, I have a perspective, these perspectives meet and hopefully create a new perspective and learning for both of us, like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? Something new comes from this kind of meeting of two ideas. So there's always some friction in human communication and that we're all approaching things with slightly different contexts, slightly different experiences, and that this then affects how we behave in the world. That friction isn't always there when using AI. An AI model like Claude 3, Opus, or GPT 4o, which is standard chat GPT today, they're kind of sycophantic and that they suck up to you in your response. Oh, that was such a great question. And it's maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was kind of a very simple question, or maybe I have a misconception. And someone would tell me that, if I use a word incorrectly, someone will, subtly correct me, maybe, or maybe more deliberately correct me in that conversation. So that element is removed, and when you make it such that, like, conversation doesn't have consequence, like, you don't really have an effect, like, you can insult an AI and then ask it a question a second later, and your relationship is perfectly fine. That doesn't really happen in real life. There's some friction in conversation, which I think ultimately is a good thing, is it helps clarify ideas and understand that other people have feelings. The world's bigger than just like you and your ideas, and that there's other actors in this world. There's other people who have their own wills and desires and goals. But if you spend most of your day interacting with your library of chatbots, you're not really getting that. That's not to say they're not effective. I have a couple of these assistants I've made for myself. I built one on I provided it with everything the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote, like all of his letters, all of his works, all of the commentary around his works. I put it in an assistant and I just chat with it because I think I can then better query that information in those books while reading it. So it kind of changes the nature of how I read, in that I have this kind of specialized reading bot, but I don't delude myself into thinking I'm like chatting with the ghost of Ludwig Wittgenstein left by his work or anything like that. Um, but then I also have models where I'll provide it like all of the comedian George Carlin's sets, like all this stand up, like all of his transcriptions and stuff. Just so I have an AI that's a little sassy, a little mean to me sometimes, because I think that's ultimately good. I don't want to forget that either. Yeah, like generally, not everything has to be comfortable, and I don't think everything should be comfortable and easy. And human communication is messy sometimes. I think that's a feature and not a bug. And I don't think we should like, okay, now I'm telling us what we shouldn't do. How does that affect Eduate? Ultimately, like, we build a tool with a very specific case. We're not building like a chatbot, so to speak. I mean, we just we just released a new chatbot that is has a big like retrieval augmented database. So it takes this persona of an instructional designer, but we don't really use personas even. Like, I noticed like that's considered like a prompting best practice. Give it a persona, but we think that's like a superfluous step you don't really need. Like, your persona is that you're an artificial intelligence that can query information and provide me with this thing right now, which is what I need. And I think that's okay. So, yeah, not ascribing like human traits, like meaning, feelings, like that's all very s- strange to start putting on these technologies as they are. Right now, you're just chatting with your computer in a more sophisticated way than you could before. And that's really all that's changed.
Yeah, that's no, it was really helpful to hear you walk through that. I think you made a similar point earlier, which I definitely want to connect the lines on here too, because I think in what you were talking earlier too about just historically how we view search, the general way that we interact with search and how we would then search for certain things that then and a lot of times may reinforce our perspectives, and then we kind of carry on. And obviously in what you just described, even with chatbots that don't have personas or aren't intended to have this almost like character like experience, which again, I know is a very popular use case right now. Fundamentally, the way that they are still designed to be is to be highly engaging and persuasive, right? And affirming to your point. And I think one plausible scenario from the way we're setting the table here, which does concern me, is I think we've learned based on social media what that kind of leads to, right? When you have
Mm,
technology that is highly decentralized, that
mhm,
folks can go to and kind of reinforce a perspective they have about the world, which doesn't cause this friction that you're describing, right? It leads us to all feeling siloed. It leads us to us weakening our social discourse muscles, and it leads us to being polarized, right? And
mhm,
and reinforcing certain beliefs or mindsets that we have in the most extreme ends of those landscape. And I think we've learned from social media, it's not a good thing. It's caused a lot of, I think, harm on our world, especially for our young people. And I can see a lot of connections and parallels between, I think, some of these chatbots in particular, based on some of these underlying conditions we you just highlighted. And that concerns me. I think,
mhm,
because what we have to teach our young people, to be honest, what we have to teach our broader society, adults too, because we've lost, I think, our tolerance to engage in difficult conversation and disagree with somebody and just
mhm,
allow that to be a disagreement versus amplifying it to the umph degree. And if we don't have that, then what we have is in many ways current status quo scenario where there's extreme perspectives and nobody's willing to talk to each other about certain things because of the fact that we don't know how to disagree, in a civilized fashion. And these tools have perpetuated that. And I can see that a little
Mhm.
bit table setting now with some of these character bots as you described, right? I think they can be highly entertaining, engaging, but at what cost?
Yeah, it's gonna be really hard for me to stop playing Elder Scrolls 6 when that comes out, and they have AI, like, NPCs that you could just have these crazy conversations with. Like, it's
Yeah.
gonna be a great video game when I have
Mhm.
procedurally generated quests because the AI thought of something while I was talking to it, and then it just made that level of the background. Like, you have an infinite video game. Like, that's gonna be really cool, but also scary because at what point, and then I put on my VR goggles, and then it starts getting fuzzy at that point. To your point, though, I mean, maybe there'll be some interesting things that pop up around this. I think a great website would be like, just call it devil's advocate, and you go and chat with an AI bot that's just going to disagree with you
Disagree with
and
you
just
the
show you
entire
every single. Just it's never going to agree. It's just going to keep giving you counter arguments for that thing. That would be a very useful tool out there. Like I'm probably going to go on the GPT's assistant store, and we'll put that out today. And
I
like
was
then
gonna
you're
say
going
I
to
like
have,
that. You should create that,
yeah.
and I'm happy to be your first user. I'd love to play around with that as well. That I see a lot of value in something like that.
But ultimately, maybe a better use case would be a company like Perplexity, where it's like marrying search with AI. Like that's the one tool I actually use day to day. Like I don't use GPT or Claude every day, but I do use Perplexity every day. I deleted Google Chrome from my phone and I just have Perplexity and Safari now, like flying off the radar. But Perplexity is great in that one, it's going to do the massive search, but then it's going to compress that search into the 7 most viewed articles historically, and then it's going to summarize all of that information in great points and then provide me with the citations so then I can actually go and do the research myself. That's a great tool if it's going to provide me with a full scope or better than just like a cursory glance, also give me like counter arguments and things like that. So finding ways to build in that friction in communication into these responses will be an interesting development.
When you think about some of the stories of this year, maybe even some of the stories over the next 12 months, what are you keeping your eye on the ball on here as it relates to innovation stories in AI or in education that you're anticipating, aware of, maybe even directly responding to? What are you thinking about right now as it relates to AI in education?
I think a lot about frameworks and mental models for considering the technology. Most teachers aren't technical experts. They shouldn't be. They don't have to be. It's not useful for them to be. So but that might be changing, right? And that kind of reforms the job that a teacher would be doing. So for us, yeah, as I said, frameworks. And what that means is like one, frameworks for evaluating these tools. So we're putting together a research network. We're going to host an open access repository of essentially just different research articles and studies on this technology. One would be like comparative error rate benchmarking across AI educational tools on specific domains. So that might be looking at lesson plans generated by the various AI education tools, doing error rate benchmarking on that to see, level of hallucinations, bias, etc. But then also saying using the Danielson domains, the framework for evaluating upcoming teachers, like using that to evaluate the quality of the lesson plans generated so you can kind of gauge like what level teacher would create this thing. Is this at the quality of a undergraduate teacher in training? Is this at the level of a new teacher? Is this at the level of a teacher who has been teaching for 4 years, 5 years, 10 years? What does that mean? Are there different quality markers at different amounts in the profession, right? So what are the best practices? So judging what these tool outputs are and like the level at which they're doing what they purport to be doing, that's going to be one piece, but also kind of evaluating teacher outcomes. So, maybe a study design would be you have a random assessment, random trials of teachers. You have some that are in the AI group, some that are in the control group, where you do basic lesson planning. Teachers in the control group, how long did it take you to plan this lesson to this specific standard? What materials did you use? General mood around these things. How would you rate the effectiveness of the lesson that you did? And then doing the same with a group of teachers who are working with an AI tool, assuming they've received some sort of training on the tool so you can limit effects, confounding factors around not knowing how to use the tool, that kind of thing. And then kind of judging that. So the hypothesis would then be that the teacher who's using the AI tools would be able to perform more efficiently, do things that are more justifiable by the evidence basis, and feel less burnout while doing it. That would be the hypothesis. And then maybe you compare that against a teacher who's been doing it for 10 years, and then you give them an AI tool and then see how that affects their performance versus a 10-year teacher without, and kind of doing the different work there. So that's one framework, evaluating the effect of a tool. Other frameworks would be like adoption frameworks. So what does policy look like? How does a school go about adopting this? What are the best practices in doing the adoption? How long should this kind of tech intervention take? Is this a thing like a smart board where you can onboard pretty quickly, make your purchase, get them installed, and away you go? Or is this going to require significant investment in training and professional development? So what does that framework look like? And what are the specific skills and dispositions that a teacher using AI needs? And how do you inculcate those into your staff? So there's like a lot of those ideas that we're thinking about. From a tool design perspective, then that means like, how do we bake a lot of that in to make that workspace intuitive so that it complements the teacher's workflow and doesn't force them to learn how to do something completely different, right? How do we complement what they already do with the technology? So, yeah, frameworks, workflows, kind of getting the sense of the infrastructure that we need in place for the effective adoption of the technology, and then building around that.
Yeah, I appreciate you walking me through that. I mean, I so many, signals were going off in my brain here of just like the implications on like teacher training and how that could be completely transformed with having some of those conversations, having some of that research, even some of the practices for like how to bring in obviously some of the tools of an Eduaide into just the craft and like what that means for that experience. So really excited to just see what comes of that. And as you all continue to go on this journey, Thomas, this has been a really great conversation. I'd love to close out with this last question here, which is, as you on the individual level, someone who's been joining us on this throughout this conversation up to this point, maybe has a little bit of AI experience or, even a little bit more than that. But just for an individual person trying to navigate this moment that we're in right now, any lessons learned or words of wisdom you would leave that person?
Yeah, probably there's no rush. I'm not sure why everyone sells that there's a rush. I think it's just kind of our culture today. Everything is just very instant gratification, prime now. I can order something and have it on my doorstep in 24 hours. Like, not everything needs to move so quickly. And using or evaluating a technology that you're going to use in your classroom shouldn't be a process that you rush. If you feel like you're doing quality teaching right now, there's no reason why you need to throw out the playbook and adopt an AI tool. And, it's not going to make you better at that point. That's not what this technology will do. It's not going to cure all of your problems either. What I would suggest someone who's interested in the technology do then is, I think, what I said at the top of the show, which is strip away all technology and just look at, what do you want to improve on as an educator? What are some areas in your classroom that you could use support in that you don't get? Or what are areas or techniques or methods you've always wanted to try, but never felt like you had the support to try out or the materials to try? And then maybe think about how you could use an AI tool to close the gaps on those problems. Or maybe it's not even an AI tool. Just kind of get a sense of what tool might help best assist you. And maybe it's simple. And if it is simple, settle for that. If you need pen and paper, like, you don't need to go out and buy classroom sets of like whiteboards and things like that. But if the simple technology will do, the simple technology will do. There's a reason pencil and paper is stuck around so long, is there's something about it that we find effective. So yeah, I mean, just don't rush, take your time, read, and make decisions based on what you do now and what you want to improve on, individually or on a department level or on a school level if you're a decision maker.
Thomas, this has been a great conversation. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. This has been great.